CEU Medieval Radio, Past Perfect, the talk show about medieval and early modern culture.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Past Perfect, CEU Medieval Radio's program on everything medieval and early modern. I'm Roman Timoshevsky, and joining us today is Tracy Adams, professor at the Faculty of Arts, European Languages and Literature of the University of Auckland, whose research interests primarily lay in the field of French literature, women's history, and queenship. She is the author of numerous publications, among which is the book on Isabeau of Bavaria, Christine de Pizan, and Agnès Sorel. Professor Adams, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Good to be here.
Professor Adams, since you have listed the results of your past research, could you maybe reveal a mystery and tell us what are you working on right now?
I'm working on a book on Anne Boleyn, which is something different. And I'm sorry I'm moving outside the scope of your podcast because I know that you're focused on the medieval period. But I've always been fascinated with Anne Boleyn, like I think probably half of the world, and started reading about her when I was a little girl. And so this is sort of going back at the end of my career to something that I was always so excited about. And I had the opportunity to do it. And so I've taken it. And my primary interest is in desexualizing her because she comes to us in popular imagination as this very beautiful, seductive sort of woman with bizarre flaws. It's true, sometimes 6 fingers and various malformations, but always very seductive. And so that's the thing that I'm interested in, trying to peel away this very modern perspective on a woman of the 16th century who could not possibly have been considered sexy because the concept just didn't exist in the 16th century. And once you peel that away, you're left with a very sober, sort of austere figure, and it just sort of lets you start all over and think about her as a religious figure.
Talking about Anne Boleyn and other characters of your works is always very fascinating topic, especially today, with our today's perspective of feminism. It would be very interesting to know how you came in your academic career to study of this kind of topic about medieval women and especially women in power, and how you became interested generally in studying medieval women's history.
Yeah, you just used the expression feminism, and I think that would be sort of a natural conclusion. You would think someone working on women in the Middle Ages would be interested in that area as a feminist. And it's not that I'm not interested in that, but my interest has always actually been more in seeking the truth in this age of disinformation. So when I started my career in the 90s, or the mid-1990s, we were just sort of entering into a period that has culminated in what we have today in many parts of the world, a period of disinformation. And the way chroniclers wrote about women in the Middle Ages was so full of disinformation that I was always interested in trying to understand what the sources were saying and why they were saying what they were saying, and trying to understand what the motives behind the terrible things they said about women were. And so I was interested in that, I think, first and foremost, because I've always been interested in how to find or how to get as close to the truth as you possibly can. For a long time, it wasn't a very popular idea, but now I think we've had a rebirth of interest in the truth because it has suddenly become so topical. So I would say that I'm interested I was always interested in women of the Middle Ages for the same reasons that everyone is. But as a teacher especially, I'm most interested in them because they give you a way of talking about how to seek the truth in a sort of neutral way. So I don't have to talk about politics to my class. I can talk about the Middle Ages and make the same point and show students how easily you can hoodwink people for hundreds and hundreds of years with a simple statement that was a lie told for a particular reason.
In this case, could you tell us, please, which role women in general can play at the medieval society and especially at medieval royal courts, and what life strategies can they think of to navigate their own life?
Yeah, then you asked a lot of questions there, and they're very hard questions. And let's see, I think that I'm going to say two things in particular, and then we can kind of branch off from those. But first of all, if you want to think about the sorts of the sort of authority or influence that women had at court in the Middle Ages, depending on what role they filled, were they a queen or were they the daughter of the king, or did people had different roles, obviously. But I think that most of all, the first thing I want to say is that it depends. I'm just struggling with that because whichever situation you take, it matters very much. For example, what kind of person the king was. Did the king like women? Was he very influenced by his mother, for example, to believe that women were worthy advisors? And if so, then he might very well have female advisors in the form of, say, his sisters, his friends, the wives of prominent courtiers. So it just depends. So it depends in general on the personality of the king, but it also depends, and here, this is the part that I was really hesitating with, it also depends on the degree to which the court has been bureaucratized. So there's a feeling, and I think it's probably true, in earlier periods when power was very much informal, when you didn't actually have specific roles that were named and had to go to men, in those cases, it was much easier for women to wield influence because they weren't particularly visible. If you don't have like a Secretary of State who is the only person who's going to give you advice on international relations, if you don't have those very particular roles, then women can play much bigger roles sort of informally. And I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but the problem is just that you actually have to look at each person, and then you can sort of understand by looking at what was written about them and what we know about the way the court was set up, how the system was working. We'd have to tell a different story about each person that we're interested in. And so I apologize for that answer, but it's the same thing with the same kind of problem that you run into when you talk about, well, did people in the Middle Ages really believe in hell? Were they really very religious? And the answer is always yes and no. Probably not nearly as much as we think they were, because they did things all the time that they would have freely acknowledged were sinful. And if they truly believed they were going to go to hell for that, then they probably wouldn't have done it. And yet they did at the same time very much believe in devils and the possibility of going to hell. So it just depends that people are people, and they have relationships that are more or less influential. Just depends on who the people are and what sort of opportunity they have based on the types of jobs that are available, the different offices that are available.
In this case, we can turn to the particular example of noble woman in power, about whom you wrote a lot, and it is the Isabel of Bavaria, with her complicated fate at the French royal court. Could you tell us more about her?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the name Isabel of Bavaria is not a name that you would immediately associate with the Queen of France if you didn't know who she was, but she was the Queen of France, born right around 1370 or thereabouts. She married King Charles VI. She was brought to France on a sort of audition. I mean, Charles VI inherited the throne quite young. He was about 14 when he inherited the throne, and so his uncles were very much in charge of him and his government in the early years. And so they wanted to get him married. And Isabeau of Bavaria, because her father was an ally of Philip of Burgundy, the uncle of King Charles VI, seemed like a likely possibility. And so they brought her over to see if the king fancied her. And so without telling her why she was there, she was brought before the king. And according to the chroniclers, he fell in love with her at first sight. And so these very young people were married to each other. They're in their teens, not even in their mid-teens yet. And so she came into a strange country, and she and the king seemed to be very much in love. In 1388, the king sort of threw off his uncles and said, I'm going to rule on my own from this point on. And after that, Isabeau got a very beautiful coronation. So she entered into this period that promised to be like just a time of prosperity and just wonderful for everyone. And then, of course, it didn't last because King Charles VI began to suffer from episodic insanity, and that would plague him for the rest of his life. And we don't really know what was wrong with him. Maybe schizophrenia. That's maybe probably the most common explanation. And that caused horrendous problems in the kingdom because it instigated a struggle for power between the king's uncles, who came back on the scene, and the king's brother, who the king himself appointed to serve as regent. Not specifically when he was insane. He didn't write it quite like that, but that was the idea. And so Louis of Orleans was going to be the regent, and then Isabeau was going to be the guardian of the children, aided by the royal uncles. And so there you have the basic setup, which sounds workable, but it turned out that it really wasn't because of the rivalries among the male members of the family. And so what eventually happens is that the king or his counselors, you can't really tell. We don't really know exactly how stable the king ever was, how lucid he ever was after he began suffering from these episodes. But the king decided that there would be no regent at all, because that seemed to be causing so much trouble. There wouldn't be any regent. The king would be the young king, so the heir would become the king no matter how young he was, whether he was 10, 13, whatever, he would become king. He'd be crowned instantly. And then the mother, in this case, Isabel of Bavaria, the guardian, would take care of him essentially. And so with no regent, she would effectively govern the kingdom. So it was never stated that Isabeau would rule the kingdom, but because she was the guardian of a minor king, she would effectively become the regent. What happens is, because the role was so ill-defined, and because she found herself in the middle of this very polarizing kind of struggle, she was never actually able to impose her own will. The powerful lords of the kingdom, who the king would have called to arms to defend him, were divided up among the male members of the family. And so Isabeau really didn't have an army to call on to impose her will. She wouldn't have wanted to do that in any case, because this is squabbling within the family itself. And so she, to a large extent, was trying to balance the different factions, and never very successfully, because, and here I think that the situation in the United States right now is fairly telling, fairly instructive. You cannot get anything done in the United States today because of the polarization of the two political parties. And you can say, I'm going to work between the aisles, I'm going to bring the two parties together. You can't. You cannot bring feuding parties together and actually see any kind of progress. In fact, feud theory tells us that to overcome a feud, the only thing that can happen is that one party has to decisively win. As long as you've got a sort of parity of power, you're going to have an endless struggle. And that's the situation that Isabeau of Bavaria found herself in. So we can think of her as the first female regent of France in a certain sense, but not a very successful one, but not through any fault of her own, through the fault of the warring male members of her family. So in any case, then back to the original question, Isabeau of Bavaria is well known for having not very successfully managed the kingdom during the periods of insanity of the king. And for this reason, and also because she was German, during the 19th century, the French really did not like the Germans for obvious reasons. So she has been vilified. She was vilified by 19th century French historians, and then her bad reputation is stuck. And it's only really quite recently that she has been redeemed. They've been looked at much more sympathetically.
Referring back to her image as the queen, and especially since she, as you said, took part in the political struggles within the France at the time, what were expectations of her as the queen, and how it faced reality?
Yeah, well, For Isabeau in particular, the expectation was that she would mediate between the warring factions. So the Orleanese to later become the Armagnacs and then the Burgundians. So the idea was that she would bring them together, and they have a very ritualistic sort of way of doing it. They all stand up in front of an audience, and then the queen brings them, the two men together, and they hold hands, and she says, now let's all get along, essentially. And the idea was that through that kind of ritual, you would actually create peace. So that was the expectation, and that's not unusual. Women were often seen as peacemakers. So kings were often not able to negotiate between themselves. They had to have their counselors do that, and then the queens would often take a very important role, like physically present in front of an audience, and through them, their own peacemaking, bring peace to the kingdom. So that was the expectation. The problem is that it just doesn't work unless you've got incentives. Force, for example, if you've got a powerful army, you can sometimes force people to go back home and you stay there, not come back to court. And in fact, that's one thing that Isabeau ordered, was that Louis of Orleans and Philip of Burgundy just stay away from court for a while, because they're disrupting all of the government work. But she couldn't keep them. She couldn't keep them from coming back to court because they were simply too powerful. I mean, physically too powerful. They had armies. So the expectation of peacefulness was constantly sort of running up against the reality of raw power. And if you've got an army, you're just always going to have a lot more power than a person who has a certain amount of authority as a queen, but can't impose her will. Yeah, so there was a big gap between the expectation and what she was actually able to accomplish.
As the public figure, Isabel of Bavaria might have been closely examined by her contemporaries. So, how many sources do we have to judge it? And do we have mention of her at all?
Yes, when you start actually listing the sources that any one queen of the Middle Ages appears in, it's always startling to realize how little anyone says about them. So relative to other people, there's quite a lot that was written about her by contemporaries. But if you actually start to count them, you've really just got a few chronicles. And it's even narrower than that, because one of the big chronicles is actually just, it takes all of its information from another. So it's not as if it's coming up with any original information. So you've always got to be aware of who's copying whom and who knows whom and why they're writing. So there are maybe 4 chronicles that talk about her quite a bit. And by quite a bit, I mean that they might mention her, 8-10 times with a little paragraph. So it's just not a whole lot of information in the chronicles, but they do give you an idea of not necessarily what people in the streets were saying about the queen, because they pretend to be talking about the people in the streets. They use words, their favorite word to describe people's discontent is they say that the people were murmuring. So, and the same word in Latin too. So they say that when they want to criticize Isabeau, they say that people were murmuring. But it's not as if they actually go out and interview people to find out what they thought. I mean, they were probably, in fact, people on the streets were probably to a large extent unaware of what's going on in the palace anyway. But there are a couple of chroniclers who are getting information from somewhere, and it's quite obvious. There's one year, 1405, we're still talking about Isabeau in particular. The year 1405, she is an ally with Louis of Orleans at that point, and so the Burgundians don't like her, and so you can tell that the Burgundians are giving the information to the religieux of Saint Denis, the monk of Saint Denis. So they're getting their information from her enemy, and you can see, because suddenly in that one year they say that the people were murmuring about Isabeau and Louis because they were spending so much money, they were so lavish and extravagant, and they were so greedy, that kind of thing. Which then comes down to the 19th century as Isabeau as this cupidinous, frivolous woman who is always collecting jewels, that kind of thing. And it's based on her enemy's evaluation of her. So it's really sort of ridiculous that has been blown up to the extent that it has been. Although I have to say now historians are on the alert for that kind of thing. So historians today will look at that and say, well, who wrote that and why did they write it, and so on. So all that we know about Isabeau comes down to just a few chronicles. There are accounts. I mean, so for several years of her reign, we have the accounts. We know what she was buying. There are the regency ordinances that were promulgated by the king or maybe by his advisors that specified the kind of job that she would have. So her guardianship of the children, and she was also appointed mediator between the warring factions. And there you go. There's very little visual material. There are some pictures of her, some illuminations and manuscripts, but we don't have a portrait of her. There is a statue that may or may not have been created from life, so it may look like her, not. And there are a couple of sketches, portrait sketches that may be her. But I think now I told you the extent of the information on her, and so much of it you're just kind of piecing together, just kind of pulling it out of the chronicles and then trying to make sense out of all of it and hoping that you haven't gone too far astray.
So, not to exhaust the topic of Isabel of Bavaria, we can move a little bit further in time and switch to another figure of your interest, which had totally different position from Isabeau of Bavaria, namely Agnès Sorel, the mistress in French royal court in the 15th century. And it's very fascinating that her position was completely opposite to what Isabel of Bavaria had. So could you please explain us about her role and position that she occupied at the royal court, and how this very tricky status of mistress was viewed by contemporaries?
Yeah. And once again, there's so many questions in there, so I'll try to you stop me if there's something that I'm missing. But why don't we just start with the French royal mistress? And that's something that I worked on before the Agnès book. I worked on a sort of survey of the French royal mistress with my sister, who is a historian, my sister Christine Adams. And what we hypothesized was that the French royal mistress is different from mistresses in other parts of Europe, in that she became a tradition, and so mistresses would refer to each other and sort of model themselves after earlier mistresses, and so they were aware of themselves as occupying a very special place at the French court. Different from mistresses in other countries where you would have the occasional very powerful royal mistress, but they were sort of one-offs. They weren't something that was expected, that was understood as part of the king's grandeur. And there are records of people, say, of German princes, for example, saying, you have to have you got to have your palace, and you have to have your royal mistress, just like the French king. That's what it takes to be a great king. So there was this idea that the French royal mistress was something special. And Agnès Sorel, she's typically cited as the first important royal mistress. I mean, it's not as if the kings didn't have mistresses before that, but we really don't know who they were. I mean, they weren't important in the sense that chroniclers would write about them and that people knew about them or talked about them. Agnès Sorel changed that. She was well known during her own time. Chroniclers write about her, but I think that she's probably the best known today because of that picture of the Virgin Mary, who is believed to have the features of Agnès Sorel. So it's not a portrait of Agnès Sorel, but Jean Fouquet apparently gave the features of Agnès, who was probably already dead by that time, to the Virgin Mary in this donor portrait of Etienne Chevalier, who was one of Agnès's, one of her allies, one of her friends at court. I think he was the treasurer for Charles VII. And he commissioned a donor portrait with himself kneeling, and then on the other side you see the Virgin with the little Christ child. So Agnès, I think was interesting because there wasn't a position in the court system at that point for a mistress, so she didn't fit in easily into a known position. And later on, it becomes clear that mistresses have their own place. They're expected, and they fulfill certain duties. And one of the things that they have to do is pretend they're not the king's mistress in certain situations. So everyone knows who they are, but they act as if they are just like lady in waiting to the queen, for example. And then as long as no one talks about it in public or in awkward situations, then everything works just fine. Agnès became Charles VII's favorite at a period when that had not yet happened, and so she scandalized chroniclers. They write about her as someone who had she had been raised to a station way above what she deserved, and she was a humiliation to the queen, and so on. And you really don't see that in later writings about the mistresses, where I imagine that ordinary people were scandalized by their presence, but people at the court were not at all scandalized, and they were in fact sought after by diplomats because they had all kinds of information and they could influence the king, so they occupied important political positions. As for Agnès, we don't really know if she had a political position or not. There are certain hints, kind of subtle hints, that she was very influential with the king, but there are also hints that she wasn't. So it is hard to know how to read the material.
So counting the very informal position at that point, which Agnès Sorel occupied in the royal court, what was her actual influence on the political events in France at the time, and how she managed to take part into political processes, if she did?
There's a story about her that became popular about 130 years after she died. And the story is that, actually, I've got to reverse for a second. It's a story that's based on a hint, okay? So something that was written in about 1460 by a person who would have known her. He was the husband of her daughter, or maybe the father of one of her daughters. So a person in the family, in any case, who knew her, and he wrote a chivalric romance. And in the chivalric romance, which was a roman clé, so the people in the story were real historical figures, but their names were changed. And so in this story, there's a point where a very beautiful young woman stands up and she upbraids the king, telling him that you've got to go and get the English out of this country. You know, you can't just laze around as you're doing. And then the king becomes very humiliated, and he goes off and he kicks the English out of France. English were occupying France at that point. And so that little bit of the story, which is just a couple of lines, then kind of gets woven into a much more elaborate story about 100 years after that, so about 130 years after Agnès' death. And it becomes a whole long story about how Agnès found the king, who was just kind of lazy and not a good warrior and so on. And then she met him and he fell in love with her, and he just wasted all of his time with her. And so she finally prodded him to go out and do your job, king. You know, I thought that I was going to marry, or I thought that I was going to be in love with somebody who was very powerful and strong, and you're really an embarrassment to me. So just get out of here and go kick the English out of France. And so the king began to cry, and then he did just that. So the idea is that her influence on him was good, and that she turned him into a powerful warrior. It depends on how literally you want to understand the story. I mean, as a matter of fact, she met the king after he had already become a warrior. Historians see a sort of transformation as he grows up. He's disinherited by his father Charles VI, and in favor of Henry V of England, and so he has to chase his crown for years and years, always fighting with the English, trying to get his kingdom back. But by the time he meets Agnès Sorel in about 1444, he has already become a warrior king. So it can't really be the case that she was the person who's responsible for his transformation. But if she influenced him, it would have been like that, probably. She would have been a moral support. Maybe she gave him political advice. We don't really know. There's just no recording of any kind of conversation with him. But the one thing that we do have are some allusions and various depositions to her as being too powerful. So people complain that she has too much influence over the king. And so from that, if you want, I don't know, what do you think? I mean, can you extrapolate from that she in fact was influencing the king, or is that just the sort of typical misogynistic complaint about any woman who is around the king?
What I definitely can extrapolate from this is that, as you perfectly explained, even her story also depends on some kind of rumors like information. So speaking about rumors that were surrounding both Isabeau and Agnès Sorel, and maybe your new research figure of interest, namely Anna Boleyn, to what extent the later historical narrative and our perception of these women were based on rumors which were translated by contemporaries?
Yeah, you've just hit on what I would say is probably the single greatest preoccupation of people who work on women, women who have been written about in any case, women who have these rumors about them. What do you do with these rumors? I mean, how do you have any idea whether they're true or not? Because, I mean, the fact of the matter is that there are always oral traditions that are passed down from people who actually were there, who saw the people, get passed down quite accurately. You probably know stories about your grandparents and maybe your great-grandparents, and they're often quite accurate. And if you had a historian writing your family's history, then they would pay a lot of attention to the things that you could tell them about your grandparents, right? So contemporaneity is that a word? Being contemporaneous isn't necessarily the only thing that you can rely on. You can rely on stories that get passed down through oral tradition too. The problem is that as a historian working 500 years later, you just don't know which ones are true. We also know that people lie in their own times. And so just because you find something that was said when the person was alive, depend on it being true. So having said all of that, how do you actually deal with these rumors that show up in written records and people's memoirs and that kind of thing? How do you decide what's true and what isn't true? And my answer is, once again, it just depends on what you're working with. It depends on the source, what the source meant to do, and a lot of admitting to the people that you're writing for. So as an author, you're always saying, this is the source I'm taking this from, and this is how I interpret it. But you, dear reader, you may have a different interpretation. And if you want to try your hand at interpreting this material, here's where I got it. So a lot of stuff is digitized today, so you can often send your readers to a particular document, or if you can't, you tell them where the manuscript is stored and so on. So you don't have to believe me. This is just what I think, but you should go and check for yourself. So I think that the most important thing as a historian of women is just to be upfront about what you know, what you don't know, what you think, and why you think it. And I think that one of the biggest objections is that so much of what you read in histories is just sort of recycled secondary source. So you read you wonder, how did you know this? So you read the footnote and it sends you to another secondary source, and that sends you to another secondary source, and you never know where how they knew this kind of thing. And I'll just give you one example because it's what I was just working on yesterday. It matters a lot to me because of the argument I'm making about whether Henry VIII wanted to marry Anne Boleyn from the very beginning, or whether he sought her for his mistress initially. The dates matter very much, and so I read that Anne Boleyn went back to Hever, to her family home, in 1526 and 1527 for Christmas. That matters a whole lot to me because if she didn't go back, then there's a good reason for Henry VIII to have written to her in 1528 because verifiably she was gone at that point. And so I read that she was gone in these 2 years, and then I follow the footnotes, and you go back and back and back, and all you get are other primary sources, often people citing themselves. So So one of the footnotes sent me to a particular work that I couldn't get my hands on, so I bought the thing on Amazon. I got it, and I couldn't wait to read where they got this information. And all they did was they cited themselves the very same article that I'd been sent to this source in the first place from. So this complete circle. And that kind of thing is really annoying. I understand that we're doing a lot of interpretation, but I think the interpretation should be based on primary sources, not on something that someone just like pulled out of the sky. So anyway, that's the rumors are kind of like that. You can trace them back to a certain point usually, but you often end up, if you're working on someone in the, say, from the 16th century, you'll go back to the 17th century and you can't go any further back. So you don't know what the relationship between the truth, what really happened, and the thing that you're seeing written would be. So you spend a lot of time tracking the rumors down to the furthest point that you can, and then all you can do is tell your reader, I was able to trace it back to here, I can't go any further. I don't know where they got this story, whether it's true or not. Maybe it is. It's 100 years late, but it doesn't mean it's not true. A different kind of rumor, though, is something that I do a lot of work with are letters of ambassadors. And so they're writing back to their lords about what's happening at court. And so they're transporting a lot of rumors. And there you're dealing with a different kind of thing, because the ambassadors are typically not talking to the king himself. I mean, they'll have presentations. They'll get to meet the king, but they don't spend a lot of time talking to him because the king is busy. Same thing with the rest of the royal family. And so the ambassadors are always picking out informants and paying them often to get information, to get like the close-up information that they can send back to their lord. So they'll freely tell their lord that so-and-so said this, but you never quite know if it's true, and the ambassadors themselves don't really know if it's true. And so there you're always trying to, you look at something and you say, well, this involves a physical gesture, so that is probably likely to be true because you can see it. So someone reports that someone did something, you can be quite sure that probably actually happened because they're typically not making things up wholesale. But what you really have to wonder about are the emotions or the motives that the ambassadors then attribute to the people that have been seen performing a particular act. And they often give people the worst possible motives, and those things you have to be very careful about because they're very misogynistic, of course. In the 16th century, of course, they're going to think that women are fickle and flighty and so on. But you can often reprocess what you read through a more sympathetic lens or maybe through a feminist lens and try to figure out what was happening. Just to say that, I guess that just to sort of summarize it, I would say that I don't think that you can say that I want to believe something and so I'm going to say this is true, but I don't want to believe this, so I'll say it's not true. You have to find a sort of a consistent way of approaching a particular ambassador and figure out like who he would have known and what he was likely to have gotten right and what he was likely to be embroidering. I think as long as you tell your readers what your source is and let them look at it themselves if they want and how you interpret things, I think that's all you can do.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience. That can be very instructive and useful for the researcher or just people who will be interested in those kind of topic. The last question which I want to ask is that you're now working on Anna Boleyn, so maybe you can share with us your future plans and when we can expect publications of the results of your research on Anna Boleyn.
This very day I've been working on it, and I've been lucky enough to have written a couple of articles about Anne Boleyn, and so one is going to be coming out in December, so December 15th, so very soon, and then another one next year, I think, about the whole issue of whether Henry VIII sought her as a mistress or as a wife. So some work is coming out quite soon. As for the book, well, you know how that goes. I mean, you in your own head, you have a sort of plan that my plan is to finish writing it in 2026. And then it has to go through the whole process. It goes through the the copy editors and revisions and so on. So maybe not too far after 2026, maybe 2027 or thereabouts. But it's just so much fun that I'm working as fast as I can. I mean, every day I find something new, not new sources. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever going to find anything new about Anne Boleyn. I think all of the information is already out there. But I just keep stumbling across things written by other people at the time that made me think of different things that sort of changed my views on the details. So I hope the Anne Boleyn book will be out in maybe 2.5 years.
Mr. Adams, I want to thank you for this wonderful talk, and we are looking forward to read your book.